Michael, I am truly excited for you to be a guest on my podcast, Stratospheric Leaders, because I have had the great privilege of working at ICAP, which you founded and led for decades. And you were also one of the founder CEOs I profiled in my book, Stratospheric CEOs. You are widely regarded as one of the city's best known entrepreneurs. And I've had the opportunity to hear firsthand many of your incredible lessons, learnings, insights, and I know today's conversation is going to be much of the same. So I'm excited to dive straight in. And my first question is, there are many qualities that have shaped your success. And across history, we have seen many leaders who reshape the world in dramatically different ways. So I've chosen 7 what I believe to be iconic leaders. And I'm going to ask you, who do you identify with most and why? So those leaders, and I already have a sense of where you're gonna what you might answer this with, but I'm gonna go with
Oh,
Einstein.
really? You know already?
I think
Go on.
Einstein, Churchill, Steve Jobs, Caligula, Genghis Khan, Logan Roy from Succession, if you've watched that, or Maximus Decimus, who is the gladiator.
Um, I- I'm amused you're putting people like Genghis Khan or Caligula, obviously extraordinarily violent individuals. Um, no, I don't know. You know, I didn't really ever set out in business to say I want to be like so and so. There are people in that list you gave who I profoundly admire. Churchill, obviously a phenomenal political figure, a man who had had big ups and downs in his careers. I had some pretty good ups and downs in my careers, not as dramatic as Churchill's, but obviously an extraordinary man at an extraordinary time who did a phenomenal job for our country. And I've always been a great admirer of Churchill, but he's a military and a political figure more than a business figure. I mean, Steve Jobs is a business figure, obviously an outstanding man, a perfectionist. I didn't know him at all, but I imagine probably a very difficult person to work with in many ways, but a genuine genius. We've got others. I'm surprised you haven't put someone like Elon Musk on your list, who's quite clearly another of this our generation, of our current century, possibly the most exceptional businessman this we have seen in modern history. And it will be very interesting because he is clearly by no means coming towards the end of his career. He is, I would say, midway through it. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes forward. In terms of business people, something you haven't mentioned, I've always had Richard Branson actually in held him in high regard. I have met Branson. I don't know him well at all, but I have met him. And I think, I mean, he obviously had as well hiccups in his careers and moments of controversy. But he's been an incredible creative in the United Kingdom, in building businesses from scratch, from a very modest background and very modest startup himself. He was completely self-funded initially, and I think he's a great entrepreneur. And the UK has profoundly lacked entrepreneurs, business builders, in the same way that the United States has had many who have built exceptional businesses. You think of Microsoft, and the people involved with that, Nvidia, Amazon, Bezos. The UK hasn't had nearly as many who have seen that those projects through, and probably Branson is the one that stands out most.
And when in our initial conversations, you shared one of one of your missions was to build a world-leading business, and you just referenced Branson there as a business builder. What was your vision? Like, what was the problem you were looking to solve for when you had that idea?
My father was a civil servant, and I love my father very much. He was a very clever man. He came from a very modest background. He was an only child, and his mother was widowed before he was a year old, so he never met his own father. Yet he went on, fought in the war, then joined the colonial service, and then United Nations after the war. And I held him in very high regard. But I said to him early on in my life, Daddy, I really think you've done a great job in what you've specialized in, but I have an urge to go and work in commerce, in enterprise, in business. I actually want to go and build a business, make some money, and that is what motivated me. And when I went to university, I did a degree in physics, but I had no intention of pursuing a career in physics, although physics I found a very useful subject to study because obviously it requires a fairly high degree of numeracy, and I think numeracy is a very, very valuable tool in financial and any business world. And I knew early on that before I even went to university, that my ambition was to work in the city in finance. I joined the stock market immediately. I left university in 1976. Stockbroking firm, not a medium-sized stockbroking firm, which I enjoyed and learned a lot from. And I did a variety of other broking jobs. One of them working with Drexel Burnham, which taught me a hell of a lot. It was an American firm at a time when the City of London was still predominantly a British financial centre, and Drexel taught me a lot about, the motivation to work hard and make money. And the British firms that I had worked for were more interested sometimes in your family and your connections and which club you're a member of. I'm slightly exaggerating, but not totally. The school that you went to was probably more important than your university. Drexel really didn't care about your family or your connections or your school, a bit more about your university, but they were most interested in whether you were hungry and motivated to actually work hard and make money. And I found that quite an elevating experience. And I think Drexel was a seminal part of my early career. I went from there to work for a British money broking firm where I set up a desk for them, which was involved in financial interest rate derivatives at a very early stage of the interest rate derivative market. This is in the early 80s, mid 80s, before Big Bang, which was a radical and important change in the financial markets in London, transformed the UK and the City of London's position globally over a few years. And I ran this desk for this money broking firm, Charles Fulton. My peer group around me had no clue what we're doing in interest rate derivatives. They didn't understand them. There was at that time the new London International Financial Futures Exchange, and I was working on those futures contract and over-the-counter interest rate derivatives, interest rate swaps, which are quite closely interconnected. Again, here was where a bit of a mathematical background was extremely helpful. And I set up a broking desk that specialized in that, dealing with a lot of banks on this. And it was a very successful business. We were a small desk of 4 people, made quite a lot of money, and everything seemed to be going really quite hunky-dory and quite well. The firm I worked for went public in 1985. I had by then, fortunately, through the success of my desk and that I was running, I had built a moderately good equity position in the firm, and that gave me considerable, at the time, relatively speaking, some financial independence. I was married but had no children. My career had been fortunate. I had a nice flat in London with no mortgage. And when the firm went public, I contemplated what I wanted to do with my career. And I thought I could continue working for where I was and try and work my way up the slippery pole, the greasy pole of promotion to try and reach the top of the firm. But I'd always had an urge to run my own business. It's sort of inside of me, a strange sensation from my teenage years of I want to run our business. It sounds a bit odd in a way, but it motivated me. And I thought, this is my moment. I've got enough money that I can live without an income. Not inherited, I hasten to say. I've earned through my own endeavors. I've got enough financial independence and security. I can live without an income for a year or two. And I'm running a very successful small business. I know what I'm doing. I understand it. I think this is an opportunity maybe to set up a boutique brokering business. I approached my 3 other colleagues, just took them out for a drink after work and said, chaps, I've got a new idea. We're going to set up our own firm. And they all said, almost as if it was something out of the chivalrous knights. We're with you, they pronounced, which was very reassuring. And we all resigned from our previous employer, Charles Fulton, on maybe appropriately the 1st of April, 1986. The firm made a half-hearted attempt to persuade me to change my mind. When they realized I wouldn't, they then made a very serious attempt to persuade my 3 colleagues to change their minds. They must have felt a very powerful sense of loyalty to me, I guess, because none of them did. So the 4 of us started work for our new company. the newest broking company in London on the 1st of May. There was only 1 month's notice in those days. 1st of May 1986, in this very, very small office, about the same size as my office alone in London is. And the firm of Intercapital, it was then called, subsequently it was renamed ICAP, because of the short code on the Reuters screens. And ICAP was the name that stuck. We started our business in the 1st of May 1986, and it was a moment when, at the time, I reckon our chances of survival were at the very best 50-50. But I took the view, I was 30 years old, as I said, married, no children. My wife was working. And I just thought, well, this is it. This is my chance. If I fail, at least I'd have given it a go. And if I succeed, I might have started a new business. There were 23 other money broking firms in London, all dealing with exactly the same clients. Obviously, we were by a long way the smallest. There were some firms out there who were already then employing many, up to 1,000 staff in London. We were an absolute, a minnow would be a flattering description. I canvassed a couple of my clients before I resigned from my previous employer, saying, I'm thinking of setting up a new firm, and both of them said, don't be so foolish. Don't be ridiculous. We don't need any more. There are too many brokers in London anyway. Anyway, so the good firm of ICAP started on the 1st of May 1986, and to my we were funded literally by my own money. I put in £50,000, 50,000 whole pounds of my own money into this project, worth rather a lot more then, of course, than £50,000 is today, but still by no means an earth-shattering amount. We were all on a pretty slim basic salary. It was pretty peppercorn salary, but from the very outset, we had a very simple compensation scheme, which was very much driven by, if you make money, we don't care whether you're young, old, senior, whatever. If you can generate returns for the firm, you will get paid. Obviously, a lesson I'd learned from Drexel Burnham, whereas the British firms tend to compensate you on seniority much more than productivity, which I never fully understood. I remember saying to Charles Fulton, the firm, when I was there, I really appreciate you pay me very, very well, and I'm entirely grateful, and I'm not complaining at all. But I'm puzzled why Frank Smith, I'm inventing that name, of course, in the corner over there, does, as far as I can make out, virtually nothing and is paid roughly the same as me. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying I don't understand it. It seems to me to be a wrong way around. They said, well, Michael, you've got to understand that Frank has been here for 20 years. And, he's earned his seniority. He's worked for years and years and years. He's done a lot of good stuff for the firm. And you might not think this method of compensation is very good now, now that you're a relatively new boy in the firm. But when you've been here for 20 years, you'll be very grateful to be looked after as generously as Frank in the corner is. And I thought, you know what? I can see that argument, but it's a crap business plan. And so I said, we're going to dispense with all this seniority stuff in compensation and really focus on the people who, to use a rather hackneyed phrase, the people who delivered the bacon, got given the bacon. And we made a profit in our first month, which was a massive reassurance to me. Of course, nobody of our competitors took the slightest degree of attention of this microscopic new firm, ICAP. And we went through May with a profit, June with a profit, July through a profit. Then we came to August, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is our testing month. Let me turn my phone off. This is our testing month. Everyone's on holiday, no business. This is going to be a big tester, whether we can scratch through August. And I think on the first or the second day of August, one of the clients who I dealt with, Solomon Brothers, a great firm in those days, one of the greatest firms in many ways. It's a trading firm. The trader in Solomon, who I knew reasonably well, first in the morning, gave me an order in $1 billion of a swap. Nowadays, not considered a big number. Not a trivial number even today, but believe you me, in August 1986, for a small little brokerage firm, four men, a cat and a dog, that was a big order. And to my pleasant surprise, we managed to get the order completed in literally half a dozen phone calls, and all the clients were surprised, delighted, impressed, whatever. And I knew at that moment, I think we're going to be okay. I mean, it makes it sound terribly simple. In fairness, I I took the view when we started the firm that we were clearly in a crowded space, that we hadn't built we weren't innovators in the sense of Microsoft or Apple, really. Well, maybe Apple, you could say, is, they took other things and did a very much better job on them. So we had to do a better job. And we did all the basic things. We started early. We were in there before the competition. We stayed there later in the evening. But those are necessary conditions. They're not sufficient conditions. But I spend a lot of time tutoring the guys who work with me about financial maths. What are the numbers behind the game? Absolutely understand. Because if you understand the numbers, you'll understand the motivations of the clients. And if you understand the motivations of the clients, you'll have a head start in knowing how to do things. And there are several other things. I said, we're here to build a business in the long run, not to try and make a quick buck. And I know this sounds. What do you mean by that? There are often times in business where you come across something, and the customer is giving you an order where he could be better served by holding it off or whatever. And I just said, in the situation we find ourselves there, I'm not here to give an advice to a client, but I think you can give them a hint. Listen, I think, and particularly, I had done a big business beforehand with Japanese banks for the firm I'd worked for previously, and I had noticed that the Japanese banks had all flooded into London in that period, and indeed, because of the financial boom in Japan at the time, the banking system, the banks in Japan were they were the JP Morgans and the Citibanks of those times. Daiichi Kangyo, long-term credit banks, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, and those names were big, huge megaliths, and they'd all arrived in London, were throwing their money around. And I know a lot of the brokers in London just said, well, let's take the money as quickly as we can. And I took the big effort to say, no, we're going to look after these clients. We're going to handle them professionally, and if we're going to really do a professional job, that they know that they're getting an honest service from us, that they can rely upon. If we're making a recommendation, that they can rely on it. And that was a very important lesson to me from working with the Japanese earlier on. And then we did other simple innovations. It sounds ludicrous now. Ludicrous. But in 1986, when we started, there were no live screens on interest rate derivatives anywhere. You couldn't. It was all, and to an extent, the trading community quite liked this opacity around the marketplace, because there were some big tickets being done. It was the interest rate swap market was arguably interest rate derivatives, over the counter, and futures of interest rate derivatives. One of the biggest innovations in the financial market in that period, from the very late 70s to the 80s and 90s, and the markets grew exponentially. And I think Warren Buffett was wrong to call them instruments of mass destruction. They enabled corporates, big businesses, central banks, pension funds to manage their interest rate risk much more adeptly, much more efficiently, much more easily than had ever been possible before, taking advantage of interest rate differentials between Japan and America, Europe, Deutschmark, Lira, whichever, French franc. And but there were no screens. If someone said to you, "What's the 5-year sterling interest rate swap?" you'd say, "Well, not really sure." And you'd speak to a dealer, and there could be differences of opinions. And so we, as the broker, aggregating all of that information and spending all day, every day, and this is one of the things that, in fact, differentiated, I suppose, ICAP from our other London-based competitors. The other 23 of them were doing many, many products, money market deposits, foreign exchange, options, forward foreign exchange, certificates of deposit, local authority money, all of those sorts of things. Whereas we focused very, very, very clearly on one product set, which was interest rate derivatives. And we launched a screen. My colleagues at the time said, "What on earth are we doing? If we're providing real lifetime prices on the screen, where's the value added service on us speaking to our clients, where we are effectively sharing with them on all the phones we've got?" It was very much a telephone driven business. we're giving them the marketplace. That's my value added to my client, to tell him where the 5-year sterling swap is. So if I'm just putting it on a screen, what's the value of me speaking to him? I said, well, the screen will attract people's eyeballs. If we're the only one doing it, all the dealers will start to look at our screen because there is none other available. And the more they look at it, it'll attach our brand name to that, which is a good thing. And they will want to, and this will change their perception of us in that marketplace. And they said, okay, so how does it work? I said, well, whenever we get an order from a client, we will put it straight on the screen. And they said, well, why don't we wait a few minutes so we can just share the order first? Anyway, cut a long story short, it was one of the critical things that we did better than any of our, well, we did it first and we did it well, and it really built the reputation of the firm. Indeed, that's where the ICAP name came from, because on the Reuters screens, which this was a precursor, this was before Bloomberg existed, really. Amazing to believe now. Actually, they just started them, but people hadn't really heard of Bloomberg. So Reuters, the old Reuters trading screens, the green screen, and you had 4-letter codes, and so Intercapital was abbreviated to ICAP. Hence, and hence where ICAP came from. So, and many other things that we did over the years. I mean, stuff that, with the benefit of hindsight, looks ludicrously obvious. I mean, in the run up, you know, the exchange rate, the ERM, and all of that period, and then the ECU and the move towards the euro, it was obvious to us at a certain point the euro was going to happen. It, you know, and so I said, you know, we must build our connections with the banks in Europe. We need to have direct relations with the banks in Frankfurt, with the banks in Paris, in Milan, in Madrid, in Holland, in Stockholm, and all of those. Although they were much smaller financial centers than London, you know, there was good volumes of business that came out of SocGen in Paris, Crédit Lyonnais, CNCA, Indochine, Commerzbank, Deutsche, Dresdner, and all of those many names. In those days, the London brokers rather eschewed the European clients, because the big boys they thought were always in London. It was, you know, we had Barclays and NatWest and JP Morgan and, you know, other big names here in London, Citibank and so forth. And they were rather sniffy about the European banks. But so we went on a campaign to recruit non-British staff. Again, considered quite controversial, I have to tell you, absurdly at the time. And we employed quite a few very talented French, all men, by the way, I have to confess to you at that time. French guys, Dutch guys, Spanish, and we had a very multicultural team. And we slowly and steadily built our relations with those banks. And didn't happen overnight. It took several years. And so when the euro actually did come, I can't remember the date now, I should remember it exactly. We were suddenly the only broker who had relations across continental Europe as well as in London. And suddenly our market share just eviscerated our competitors. It was a telling moment. And as I said, you know, I've mentioned earlier, those days we were a men-only broking firm. In the early 90s, I said to the team, listen, it's all very well being a men-only team, and we're doing very well. And the firm was doing very well by then, and we grew extremely rapidly. And we had clearly built ourselves a dominant niche in the interest rate derivatives market. We built a brand name of, I think, credibility, integrity, professionalism, reliability, dominant market share. And it was a great and exciting time. And part of the internationalism, it was good fun as well, actually. You know, once you get over the British bit, it's quite good fun working with the Dutch and the French and the Italians and the Spanish, particularly when he had international football tournaments, of course, or World Cups. But I said, come on, we're going to employ some women, which was considered like, oh my God, this is an outrageous concept. I said, no, I mean, obviously, most of our clients are men. And so I said, no, we are going to find some really competent, professional, capable women to join the firm. And I think it'll be an improvement in our cultural bias. This was considered a bit of a questionable debate in the early 90s. But anyway, we went ahead and did it. And I can tell you, that one of those projects that worked out really, really well. We employed some very talented girls, not all of them English. I mean, we had some, very, very talented uh, Dutch, French, Belgian, Danish. I mean, and some of the girls many of them did exceptionally well. I mean, prior to that, we'd only employed one girl in the firm who was my secretary, who was very capable, very smart girl, actually. And she said, well, if you're allowing girls to be brokers, do you mind if I try and be a broker? And I said, Charlotte, of course you're welcome. And I have to tell you, within a couple of years being a broker, having been paid actually a very well paid secretary, she was earning many hundreds of thousands of pounds a year as an extremely good broker on emerging market debt. And so it was a lot of fun. It was a great story. Anyway, I've talked too much.
No, you're not.
No, I'm not Genghis Khan or Caligula.
And what's really interesting for me, and first of all, if my maths is correct, you were saying when you resigned from your initial firm and you had a month's notice, you resigned on April Fool's Day. Would that have been right?
April, yeah. I mean, that just happenstance, but it has a certain pleasant irony to it.
But I think I was really curious around, what was your competitive advantage? And what really struck me is about, the customer's front and centric and, front and center, sorry. And it really is about that partnership and looking to that unmet future, the electronification of the markets, the advent of the euro. And so it was always, how do we partner with our clients to give them the services that they're looking for? And
also, I mean, in fairness, our compensation system was at that time unique in London. Most of the other broking firms in London very much had a much more seniority-based structure. And we were able to go and recruit a lot of very talented younger brokers from the other firms, because I said, listen, the math is plain. If you're working for us, this is what you would get paid. What are you making where you are now? And they said, well, rather a lot less than that. I said, what's not to like about the way we do it? I mean, we ran a very disciplined structure. So, information that came into the firm was shared throughout the firm immediately. We had, big information screens, boards. So there was no hiding of information. But we were, I think in about 90, after we've been going about 5 or 6 years in 93, of the top 10 producers in all of the London broking market, 9 of them worked for ICAP.
Wow.
And it was like playing. I don't use soccer analogies. I use military analogies more often. But it's, I guess, like playing for a great soccer team when it's at the peak of its performance. Yeah. You go on, you go into battle every day, believing and having confidence that you are going to win. And if you have that confidence and you have that professionalism, you have that discipline, you do win. You do win. And success itself is a great builder of more success.
Yeah.
If you are winning and doing well, you attract better people. And obviously, I mean, there are other things that we did which I talk about quite often. I mean, we started the ICAP Charity Day in 93, when the firm had still, 93. I'm trying to guess. We had probably 200 staff.
Okay.
And no, less than that, a lot less than that. Hold on a second. I'm going to just say, and it, that was a transformation this year, the day giving money to charity. And it was interesting in a way for me that was different than the way you might think it. Of course, it was a very good thing to do, a company showing that it's going to do a really important show its real commitment to society and the world we live in. That was important. It was important because also the staff really bought into it. They felt proud about it. The brokers felt proud that they'd be able to say to their children, today we could work on this charity day where one day a year we do everything, and every penny that we generate goes to good causes. It doesn't go into our bonus pool, doesn't go to paying the firm's overhead, doesn't go to paying the rent. Every single penny, the firm Um, and it gives every penny of revenue, not penny of profit, penny of revenue to charity. And it was a very, very effective tool in differentiating us to the staff that we employ and obviously to our clients as well. So it was one of those projects that I feel very proud about it, and it worked on on multiple fronts.
And it just sounds very values driven, transparency, integrity, doing the right thing. And there was something that you shared earlier about an attitude, that work ethic, that struck me as being such a critical component of a filter for how you hire people to have that work ethic, that unwavering belief, the desire to succeed.
Yes, no, it was a great time. It was an extraordinary time in the 90s. I mean, Big Bang, which I had barely touched on, came in 1987, I think. I'm pretty sure that's right. Transformed London as a financial centre. We got a huge influx. I remember people said, there's a new firm in town called Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs. I think I've heard of them. They're American, right? And within 2 or 3 years, Goldman Sachs was a tier 1 customer. And it was a very, very extraordinary journey.
And do you think sorry.
Go on, you asked me first.
No, I was going to say, do you think in your journey that, of building this extraordinary business, has luck played a part at all?
Oh, no, of course it does. I think anybody in business who pretends that luck isn't a relevant issue is being stupid. I hate the word stupid. Is deceiving themselves or deceiving you. We all know that there are times you make good decisions and bad decisions, and it's not always 100% obvious beforehand. Should you go route X or route Y? I mean, many of the times it is. This fits our strategic plan or our ideological plan or whatever. But no, luck does play a role, and you can't. If you ask me, oh, what was the luckiest moment? I haven't thought about that in advance, but I've known lots of times, and crikey, that decision turned out better than I expected. But you use your luck. And the other thing is, don't get complacent. Complacency is a big killer of businesses.
And how do you avoid getting complacent?
I think it's an attitude of mind. And I always noticed that about our competitor brokers in London, that they were always talking about, their glories of the past. And, we had a monster day yesterday and we did this, we did that. And they really spent very little time in philosophizing about where their journey was taking them to. And I had a very strong view that complacency and arrogance are a precursor to getting your ass kicked. And I didn't particularly, I was still in my, I started the firm when I was 30, in 1986. 10 years later, 96, we were quite a big firm, making quite a lot of money, and the dominant derivative broker in London. And London was certainly the financial center of the world at that time. And I just thought, I don't want to see this fall apart, and therefore spend a lot of time working on getting rid of complacency. We'd expanded the firm significantly by then. We had a big interest rate option business built by a chap who was my business partner for many years, Gary Boom, an exceptional talent, built a superb team next to the swap team. We had an emerging market desk, which had been very successful for us, and diversified in many other products. And the firm was going extremely well. And we sort of had a moment where we sort of had to sit down and have a deep think about what's the game plan next. We're a private company, quite happy to be a private company. Great atmosphere in the firm. Disciplined, I think, and professional, as I mentioned before, but we were still we had a small office in Hong Kong, a small business in Sydney, a tiny presence in America. America, very difficult market to break into, by the way. And although a very important market, I mean, you can't be a global firm without being American financial services. And although by then we employed about 300 people, we were still by no means the biggest firm in London. Although we were probably one of the most profitable firms in London. And in 1990, and I'd recruited a chap, David Gelber, very good friend of mine then and still now, of course, and who had come to us from running derivatives at HSBC, a first senior banker we'd employed, and to really help me find out what our strategy was going forward. And we concluded that we could stay if we wanted to do and be a very powerful, rich, niche private firm making quite a lot of money and specializing, or at that point, I genuinely believed that there was a global gambit here. There was no money broking firm in the world that was really a global dominator. There were big firms in America, Garban leading amongst them, and other names, Preban, and many others, which I won't bother the names. And Exco at that point, a publicly listed UK firm, had been a very big brand name. It was a big brand name still, but it had been mismanaged without mentioning any names at all. They'd really promoted some people who are very talented brokers, but weren't particularly necessarily managers. And there's a big job difference between being a talented producer on the phone and being a manager. You know, some brokers can make the transition, but not necessarily all of them. And I mean, I was a good broker. I was never the best broker in ICAP. I mean, you know, I could hang in with the top team, but I was never at the front of the top team. We had some real superstars who could put the ball in from the back of the net from quite a long way out. Anyway, so Exco is a public company, employed about 1,500 people worldwide at the time, had big office in America, big office in London, big presence in Singapore, Australia, and in Tokyo. But the firm had built a huge middle overhead of middle managers that were non-producing, living off compensation. Yet again, go back to the story I've said to you beforehand, being paid far too much and doing far too little. So the burden on the brokers, who they had some very good brokers there, was producing a lot of money that was being frittered away. And so the firm was sliding towards, I think their market cap was about £20 million in late summer of 98, when Caledonia, who were the biggest shareholder in Exco, a very charming, important man, Peter Buckley, great man in many ways, had been in touch with me about merging the businesses. We much smaller, making money, they much larger, but having a global reach, not making money. And I was persuaded to do this transaction and take over as CEO and chairman. Had I known in more detail about the financial black hole in, mind you, can't mention black holes now if there's any politicians listening. If I'd known more about Exco's finances, maybe I'd be more nervous. But anyway, we took on the role, and when we looked into Exco, we really did find that they had a very good broking business there, a huge management level there that made no contribution at all. And we reduced the headcount by the way, the day after we completed the deal, the market cap of this new listed company, it was called Intercapital, with me as chairman and chief executive in 98, was I think £40 million, 40 million only.
Wow.
But we got rid of literally half the staff and didn't lose 1 cent of revenue. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. I know it sounds like pretty ruthless, but I'm not Genghis Khan. But this was nothing more or less than proper structural remanagement. It really wasn't. And so our share price, oddly enough, responded dramatically. It went up, I think, 4 or 5-fold in the space of a year or so. And I explained to my dear long-suffering partners at ICAP that yes, we'd sort of taken over Exco, but we're not going to behave like conquerors. There is no point in swaggering around like the arrogant conquerors. We want the best people within Exco to be our new partners. We want them to be part of our new journey. And we need to keep them. We need to show respect for them. We need to show, you know, teamwork. And I remember having some very big arguments with one or two of my colleagues saying, well, you know, we don't want any of those guys from Exco. They're all useless, sack them all. I said, well, I've got their figures, actually. I've got them here in front of me. They're not useless. They're pretty good, actually. And in many ways, you know, that we could use their help. Well, I don't want to use them. I'm quite happy. No, we've been competing with them for years. You know, Smithy there can't stand him. You know, and I said, no, we've got to get over these stereotype views of competitors and how we hate them and we fight them every day. These are now we're not the invading force. We are the new partners, and we're going to embrace them. And I had to, I'll be honest with you, I had to sack a few of my colleagues who didn't toe the line. But actually, to an extent, maybe I am colleague. A little bit of, you know, execution every now and then is a good motivation for those who watch and see that if I don't toe the line here, that a decapitation may come. So the integration went very well. Actually, some of my senior colleagues, actually, David Caston, who ran our broking business, Russell Lees have been a long-standing colleague, very talented, both some exceptionally good people to work with. That integration worked really well, and we motored ahead. We kept all the talent from Exco that was worth keeping. But even though we'd got Exco and got a big office in America then, that didn't give us everything. We were still sub-critical mass in America. And by complete fortuitous circumstance, there was another listed firm in London called Garban, which was run by British management in London. The London operation was, to be honest, was a 6 out of 10 operation on a good day, whereas they had a really first-class business in America, really first class. But the London management had to an extent sat upon American management, and it had never really flourished. But the Garban America was the dominant player in government bonds in America, interest rate derivatives, and all interest rate products. The chairman of Garban, Charles Gregson, actually, who became a very good friend of mine, a very good man, had approached me about merging the businesses. It proved a bit more complicated to do. I won't bore you with all the detail. But a year later, after we'd done the Exco deal, we merged Garban and ICAP Garban, who had a wonderful long-winded name, Garban Intercapital. We merged the businesses a year later. Charles was chairman, I was CEO. We worked together as chairman and CEO for 19 years, 20 years. I wouldn't say there was never a crossword between us, but there were very few, and I held him in every high regard quite properly. But that was a transformational deal. That suddenly brought us this big American business. And when we bought the American business, merged with the American, I got the 3 senior guys over from America to London with their wives, as it happened, and took them out for a very nice. We went to Cliveden for lunch, and my wife came with me, of course. And we wined and dined them generously. And then we had a big meeting with the 3 guys. And I said, guys, the story is this. You're all expecting me to send over a Brit to run you, because that's what the British firms nearly always do, and it nearly always doesn't work properly. Well, I realized that trying to run American firms with Brit chief executives doesn't really work the best. So the 3 of you are going to run it. And the deal is very straightforward. This is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to manage it. Steve McDermott, I said, Steve, you're going to be overall chief. Doug Roten, Doug, you're going to run the derivatives and the rates business. Ronnie, you're going to run the government bond and the bond business. And the deal is, these are the parameters I work on. This is the reporting that I expect. This is how it's going to work. I'm not going to micromanage you. You do what you work that way with me. You will run the business. You don't, you will get sacked. Okay, fair deal, fair deal. It worked brilliantly. All 3 of them finished up as great friends of mine. Sadly, McDermott died some years ago, poor fellow. Top man who I had a very great respect for. But Ronnie Papora and Doug Roten, I still am in touch with and see regularly. And that occurred. So ICAP had gone from 1986, a 4-man startup, to come the end of 2019, the biggest interdealer broker in the world, with big operation in North America, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, London, wherever. It was a good story.
It's an incredible journey. And I'm really curious, because the people around you, you know, who drove the business, who were really involved in that value creation, You mentioned that, just because you're a producer doesn't necessarily mean you've got those leadership qualities. What are the attributes you look for over the years in your leaders?
I mean, obviously the usual ones of integrity, hard work, professionalism, and timeliness. But I think there are a lot of other things that I tended to look for. One is people who are able to stand up and say they've made a mistake. There are lots of times you come across people who work in senior positions who, when things don't go right, nothing to do with me, not my fault, absolutely, all of this. And you say, no, of course, don't be bullshitting. You were there, I was there, we made that decision and you were part of it. No, I don't feel that. And anybody who didn't have the courage to stand up for when there's, because there are, bad decisions do get made. The notion that only good decisions get made is absolutely laughable. And the key actually thing is when you do make a bad decision, for heaven's sake, don't con yourself, accept it, take it on the chin, adjust and change direction. And I had a management team that stuck with me for a long time. I wouldn't say we didn't have change, of course we did, but there was longevity in our senior commanding officers. And then we went, by this time the firm was a public company, it was doing very well. We then had 9/11, where our offices in New York were in the World Trade Center. Obviously, the whole, we all know what happened then. Absolute tragedy and a catastrophe. Our competitor, Cantor Fitzgerald, tragically lost every single staff in that building that day. I mean, awful. We were in the same building. We were fortunately much lower down. We only lost one member of staff. Poor lady was at a conference on the top floor of the first tower that was hit, and nobody obviously survived. But that was an existential period of threat to us. I didn't know if we'd survive that, but we did. To an extent, we emerged from it stronger than we did beforehand. We had a small management team that handled all that crisis management, and I learned from that that a small number of people really dedicated to handling a crisis, that you tell other people to get on with their jobs. You don't let too many people get involved in it. You really work hard. You can handle the crisis. You can get a remarkable amount done. And it changed my view on issues about backups and all of that in crisis management. Very huge lesson I learned from that. Then in 2006, we went into the FTSE 100 index, which in one of the notes you sent me of achievements in my business career, I would say obviously founding ICAP was a great one. The charity day is another one. And going into the FTSE 100 index, a company had started with £50,000. 20 years later, you're in the FTSE 100 index. And we hadn't raised one penny of cash between 1986 and 2006. Okay, so it's it's a 20-year journey, but there we are.
And how did that feel the moment you went into the FTSE 100?
Well, it goes back to the old thing I had, arrogance and complacency. So there's one day of celebration only. And then after that, you roll up your sleeves and say, that is the past. You cannot keep celebrating the past. What are you going to go and do in the future? The future is more complicated. We had obviously many years of great success. The future is more complicated because we're running a bit short of time. I know you're running short of time. So the financial crisis changed the game considerably. Technology had already begun to change the game significantly. Fortunately, maybe because I'd done a science degree, I bought into technology a lot more than our broking competitors. And we had, in 2003, managed to buy BrokerTech, the electronic government bond platform, from a consortium of banks. 2006, we managed to buy the EBS, the foreign exchange platform. So we had two very big electronic platforms. We'll build a big technology base post-trade business as well, built around interest rate derivative compression. And so we had some big assets in the technology space as well, which put us in good stead. But the one thing that came hard over to me, about the financial crisis is that the whole of the banking trading industry has changed. Suddenly, in 2005, you went into a bank trading room. There was a hubbub of noise. You will remember it yourself. There's people shouting across the room, screaming, and a real hubbub. 2005, it was like deathly quiet. Everyone's looking at screens. Everything's being done by computers or keyboards. And so I realized that the voice broking business had been, was, to put it politely, an ex-growth business. And we managed to complicate it, drawn out, stole the old ICAP brand name and the voice broking business. But by the way, at this point, we had 5,000 staff, 60 odd offices around the world. I mean, it was a big operation. We sold it to what had formerly been our big London competitor, Tullett Prebon, had been run by Terry Smith. He had moved on since then run by a chap called John Fazzackley, who actually, funnily enough, we became good friends, although we were adversaries in that transaction. Tragically, he died not that many years ago, early, far too young, very, very good man. Anyway, we sold our voice broking business to Tullett Prebon. A sad moment, a lot of my friends going behind, but the right thing to do. It was a good deal, a very good deal. We got paper for the deal, but we got paper when the share price of Tullett Prebon was about £4.50. I cashed out of my shares at that point. Proved a good decision. And we were left with then the technology assets, which were rebranded NEX Group, Next Group, not to be confused with the UK clothes retailer, very much bigger company than we were too, run by offenders, it happens. And that was then bought a year and a half later by the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, a deal that completed at the end of 2018. So I had completed 22 years of running what had been a small startup, finished up being quite a big business. The exit at the end was a very, very good exit. The shares were at an all-time high by a considerable margin on the last day of trading in whenever it was, November 2018. And anybody who had been there from the beginning as a listed company, probably not many people, I had been anyway. I think it was a 63-fold return for those who had been on that full journey. And it was a great story and a great journey, and I feel very proud about it. And I have, of course, there are things I could have done better, things we should have done better. There are lots of ifs and buts, but broadly, I look back with overwhelmingly happy memories.
And to kind of close out, with your children, you have 3 children, given the experience that you've, that 22 years of that startup taking it into a big business with that 63-fold return, what is the one key lesson you share with your children?
Well, my children are all very different, really. My eldest son is a politician, fighting his way up a much greasier pole than so he's a new boy in the House of Parliament, doing very well, I think. And I have very great confidence in him and what he will achieve there, but he's got a long journey ahead of him. He's in a party which has not the fewest seats we've had in modern history. But I know he is excited about and driven by it. And all I try and share with him is my views on ethicality and professionalism and endurance. Life is not a sprint. I've seen many very, very talented people try. Perseverance matters a lot too. I have the younger son who does work with me. I enjoy working with him very much. He's got definitely a very commercial mind, and I look forward to him showing us what great stuff he can do. But I'm sure he will be different from me. And then I have a daughter who is a wife and mother with 2 young children, so her distractions are very different.
Well, look, thank you so much for sharing your journey today, Michael. Nothing short of inspirational. I've written lots of notes, and yeah, thank you for just being so gracious and sharing your career up with me.
A pleasure always. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Bye.
Michael. Take care. Bye.